The FIA has introduced a new regulation following the first race of the season, targeting the flexibility of rear wings. It appears that the governing body was not entirely satisfied with what they observed in the opening race. Although the initial assumption was that the 2 mm slot gap tolerance would be sufficient, this is no longer the case. The allowance is now being significantly reduced by over 75%. Which teams will be impacted the most? And more importantly, was Red Bull correct all along? One of the most debated topics of the 2024 season has been the flexibility of front and rear wings. However, the latter has caused greater controversy, especially after McLaren appeared to gain a considerable advantage on low downforce tracks like Baku. This issue came to light when McLaren was caught exploiting this loophole, prompting the FIA to introduce a stricter rule. The original regulation allowed a 2 mm slot gap opening under a symmetric load of 750 newtons. However, Red Bull raised concerns as early as pre-season testing in Bahrain, warning that the so-called Mini-DRS phenomenon, a term adopted by the F1 community to describe the loophole, could persist into 2025. Pierre Wack expressed concern that teams like McLaren and Ferrari had found new ways to exploit the rules. After the race in Melbourne, it became evident that the FIA shared these concerns. A closer look at the rear wing footage might make it difficult to detect the flexing, unlike in Baku, as it is almost invisible to the naked eye. Nevertheless, high-resolution images and analysis reveal that when subjected to aerodynamic forces, the wing continues to flex. This is precisely what the FIA aims to eliminate from the Chinese Grand Prix onward. The rule will be fully enforced in Suzuka, where no tolerances will be permitted. However, in China, a minor tolerance will be granted due to the short notice. Starting this weekend, teams will be allowed a deflection of 0.5 mm with an additional 0.2 mm allowance. From Suzuka onward, the 0.25 mm allowance will be removed, capping the maximum slot gap opening at 0.5 mm. Another crucial aspect of the rule states that the distance between the main plane and the flap, now limited to 0.5 mm, must be measured when a 75 kg vertical load is applied to either end of the rear wing main plane. This change will undoubtedly impact some teams more than others. If Red Bull's predictions hold true, McLaren and Ferrari will be the hardest hit. Just take a look at the rear wing of the MCL 39 and judge for yourself whether it complies with the new regulation. The FIA has compiled substantial evidence supporting this rule change, analyzing footage of rear wing deformations along with static deflection measurements conducted in the FIA garage during the Melbourne Grand Prix. In an official statement, the FIA confirmed, having analyzed footage of rear wing deformations combined with static deflection measurements taken inside the FIA garage in Melbourne, we have concluded that there is sufficient ground for a stricter test to be introduced from the Chinese Grand Prix onward. Additionally, Article 3.1.5.17 of the 2025 regulation states that if a 75 kg vertical load is applied to either end of the rear wing's main plane, the distance between the main plane and the flap must not exceed 2 mm. For the Shanghai Grand Prix, however, this limit has been reduced to 0.5 mm, with a temporary 0.25 mm tolerance allowed due to the short implementation period. Teams were informed of this revised test on March 17th. It is worth noting that during the Melbourne Grand Prix, all cars tested against Article 3.1.5.17 were found to be compliant, meaning that every car competing in that race was deemed legal. However, in light of the new regulation, it is crucial to revisit the statements made by Pierre Wack during preseason testing. He was the first to voice concerns about teams continuing to exploit the Mini-DRS loophole. Speaking to the media, he specifically pointed out McLaren and Ferrari. There's still something going on. I think Ferrari and McLaren are still using the Mini-DRS effect, Wack stated. Recent reports from the Red Bull camp, particularly from Helmut Marko, indicate growing optimism. The team believes the performance gap to McLaren could significantly shrink once the new rule is enforced. The experienced Austrian noted that the initial gap during preseason testing was around half a second, but in Australia, it was reduced to just 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. This optimism has Red Bull hopeful that the rear wing clampdown could bring them back into contention for the championship. It seems the onboard cameras installed during Australian free practice sessions have played a crucial role in detecting potential irregularities. Whether or not McLaren and Ferrari are deliberately exploiting the Mini-DRS loophole, they are now the primary targets of this regulatory change. However, it remains uncertain whether this factor alone is responsible for their advantage. Notably, Norris recorded a top speed 11 km/h lower than the fastest car, though Piastri was much closer to Leclerc. Regardless, Ferrari and McLaren were the two fastest cars, which raises questions given the FIA's recent decision. These two teams will undoubtedly be under intense scrutiny from the media. While the FIA's regulation allows a 0.25 mm deflection tolerance, meaning a total of 0.75 mm is still permissible, the impact on McLaren remains to be seen. The overall performance of the MCL39 has been impressive, so a regulation change affecting the rear wing may not significantly hinder their competitiveness. Some might argue that the FIA's decision was driven by McLaren's strong performances, but there is another perspective. Both Ferrari and Sauber used the same aerodynamic concept, suggesting that the FIA's response was based on the unintended use of the slot gap for aerodynamic gain rather than just DRS activation. This indicates that exploiting the gap for aerodynamic benefits goes against the spirit of the regulations. This is not the first time the FIA has intervened in such a manner. A similar scenario occurred during the 2023 Hungarian Grand Prix when Aston Martin introduced a legal rear wing that was later banned for violating the spirit of the regulations. However, the fact that the FIA initially deemed all cars legal in Melbourne before implementing this rule change suggests they were dissatisfied with their earlier stance on the 2 mm slot gap allowance. Even with minimal deflections, as shown in earlier footage, the aerodynamic advantage remains substantial. This is the primary reason for the FIA's immediate action to impose stricter limitations on rear wings. One cannot ignore McLaren's impressive performance gains, especially their ability to build a 15-second lead in a short period under mixed conditions. The expectation was that Ferrari's SF25, which was heavily loaded for wet conditions, would excel in rainy weather. However, McLaren demonstrated strong pace in both qualifying and race conditions. Max Verstappen was among the first to comment on McLaren's superior tire management. It was tough to overtake McLaren. We struggled with tire overheating and degradation. This was even more noticeable on the intermediates, which are softer than slicks. They managed tire temperatures better and pulled away from us quite easily, Verstappen explained. Looking ahead to China, Ferrari and McLaren will be the main focus. Teams will have only one practice session before sprint qualifying and the sprint race, which could impact their setup decisions for the main event. Unlike Australia, where mixed weather played a role, the dry and warm conditions in China may benefit teams like Mercedes. Ferrari, in particular, anticipates a stronger performance in Shanghai. Team principal Fred Vasseur stated that China will provide a clearer picture of the team's true competitiveness. Given all these developments, do you think Red Bull's persistence in pushing for stricter rear wing regulations has paid off? And will McLaren and Ferrari struggle under these new constraints? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.